Hello and welcome, my gentle and of course very modern apes. Welcome to Gutsickgibbon. This is my channel where, amongst other things, I debunk pseudoscience like young earth creationism and also keep you up to date on the latest and greatest discoveries in paleoanthropology, primatology, and numerous other subjects. So this is my first time sitting down and recording since being back from Kenya. I was gone for about a month. You guys funded my field work to do some fossil exploration out in the west of the country, and then I did quite a bit of museum work at the National Museum there in Nairobi. And for the third year in a row, while I was out there, big Homo naledi related news dropped. I don't know what it is about me being in Kenya or being in Kuru, but like, it's every time. It's gotta be something to do with the timing of like specific journal releases, I think, but it's wonderful for me because that means that every time more Homo naledi information comes to light, I'm like surrounded by people who are way smarter than me in this field, like seasoned experts, and I get to hash it out with them. This year, as opposed to last year, we didn't do much Homo naledi talking because, I don't know when you're watching this, but the past month, July 2024, has had quite a few pretty big news bombshells, so that mostly took up like casual conversation, but that doesn't mean that we didn't at least touch base on the Homo naledi stuff. But I also had a lot on my plate while I was out there, right? So I was finishing up my Leaky grant, adding some more finishing touches to my NSF, which is due here in like 2 or 3 days, and because of that, it wasn't until I got back to the United States that I actually sat down and got to read the new release, the new paper on Homo naledi, like beginning to end. And I gotta say...
Oh dear, that's not good. I feel the need to say the F word now.
This thing is kind of savage. Like, this is one of the more intense response papers that I think I might have read, maybe ever. And I've read a lot of papers. So maybe you're new here, or maybe you've been watching my Homo naledi coverage since the most recent stuff sort of dropped a couple of years ago, but either way, I think we're due for a quick refresher. Who is Homo naledi, and what the heck is going on with the controversy surrounding this odd little guy? In 2010, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger out of South Africa got a tip from some local cavers that there was bone in a nearby cave system that had not yet been really exhaustively surveyed. The cavers had taken photographs, and Lee looked at them, and yeah, there was bone in this cave, and like a lot of it. But the cave system was convoluted and pretty difficult to get into, so Berger put out a call for like relatively small individuals, people who he supposed could actually get back into the furthest reaches of this cave system, which came to be known as Rising Star. When the researchers got back there and started pulling bone up and hauling it out of the cave system, it became clear that not only was there a lot of bone belonging to a lot of individuals, but the remains were very, very weird looking, and consistently so. They looked like early members of genus Homo. So our species is Homo sapiens, our genus is Homo. Other members belonging to this genus include Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus, and moving more basally or more primitively towards about 2 million years ago, 2.8 million years ago, you get the likes of Homo rudolfensis and Homo habilis. Homo naledi looked like it fit in with those guys, the earliest members of genus Homo. And so, indeed, initially, that's what the team thought, that they had stumbled across a cave system containing a treasure trove of remains from maybe even the base of our genus, the first members of genus Homo, an ancestor. Homo naledi seemed like a good pick for this spot. It had a small brain case size of around 600 cc's, just above the Australopithecus 550 cc's, and well below the anatomically modern Homo sapiens of 1200 cc's. It was less prognathic than Australopiths. It had a more globular brain case. Aspects of the teeth even aligned it with like later members of genus Homo, specifically developmental patterns. From the waist down, postcranially, this thing was a clear terrestrial biped. It looked committed. However, the shoulder and the upper arm seem to suggest that it maintains some arboreal adaptations, not unlike what we see in Australopithecus afarensis, a really solid candidate for something that was just dipping a toe in genus Homo, but still maintaining a lot of its Australopithecus proclivities. This is an oversimplification, of course. I'm not trying to use this video to tell you all about the minutiae of the morphology of Homo naledi, but I'm just trying to tell you that the vibe at the time, in 2010, was that it was a better Homo habilis than Homo habilis. And then the dates came out. Most paleoanthropologists accept the Ledi-Gararu mandible as being a Homo habilis specimen, and if that's the case, the oldest members of Homo habilis are 2.8 million years of age. The dates for Homo naledi were considerably younger than that. This thing dated at 335,000 years of age at the latest to around 236,000 years at the younger end of things. Probably not going to be the base of genus Homo with those dates, I would propose. And indeed, the rest of the paleoanthropological community was like, yeah, that's not gonna fly. And instead, Homo naledi was relegated to this really interesting, really weird, but definitively side branch of genus Homo. An odd and late surviving vestige of the morphology that characterized really early members of the genus, just kind of bumming around in South Africa into the pretty recent past, while the rest of genus Homo, excluding Homo floresiensis, kind of went, sicko mode on their morphology, specifically brain case size. However, even back in 2010, there was a sort of additional feature to Homo naledi and to the Rising Star cave system that Berger and his team were pretty enamored with. Homo naledi is the only thing in these caves, right? The Rising Star cave system contains Homo naledi, the species, and I think it's like a baboon tooth, like one baboon piece. But the rest is Homo naledi. And that is very weird and hard to explain via flooding debris or a predator cache or anything like that. And so this led to the initial very soft proposal that maybe this was body disposal. Maybe Homo naledi was chucking its dead into a hole, and that hole was Rising Star cave system. This deliberate disposal hypothesis sort of came chain-linked to another idea that was pitched by Berger and the rest of his team, which was that Homo naledi must have been pretty cognitively advanced despite its small brain case size, maybe owing to a more anatomically modern brain organization that allowed it to engage in a complex behavior like deliberate disposal. But there is a problem with this that was recognized by many right off the bat, even back then. Ants engage in deliberate disposal. They take their dead and they move them outside of their colony because they rot and they stink and they attract predators. And so they get rid of them. It doesn't take a genius to dispose of your dead when you are a socially living species. On the other end of that spectrum, you also have Neanderthals who deliberately disposed of their dead. And they are pretty cognitively advanced, I would propose. What this means is that you can't really use deliberate disposal as a means to discriminate between animals that are not cognitively inclined and animals that are. My personal opinion is that the ant counter-argument is in part responsible for what ended up happening in this most recent set of papers in 2023. When Berger and colleagues published a set of preprints in eLife under a new publishing model that we'll touch on here in a minute, that stated that not only did Homo naledi deliberately dispose of their dead, but they were actually ritualistically burying them in those caves. You know, those caves that it's really difficult for modern humans to get to the back of with modern technology like lights and GPS? Homo naledi was actually doing that. And they weren't just like getting back there, they were dragging their dead back there, digging a hole, putting them in the hole, and burying them inside the hole. Ritualistically. And then while they were back there, they also made art. And then there's the sort of explicit and implicit, depending on which one we're looking at, argument that to get their dead back there, they used fire to light their way and cordage to keep the dead from flopping all over the place. And this was all displayed, unfortunately, in the accompanying Netflix documentary that came out at the same time as those preprints with animations depicting exactly that. And those animations were pretty cool, but these preprints had not passed peer review. They didn't belong published in eLife, let alone argued for in a Netflix documentary which holds a lot of weight in the general public's perception of what the truth of the matter actually is, in what is settled science. Worse yet, I'm sure you've noticed that I said published preprints, and those two things shouldn't really, go hand in hand. Publication usually comes after a preprint passes peer review, but not under eLife's new model, which allows the authors to publish their preprints ahead of time, and then, depending on what happens with peer review, push forward and publish them anyways, regardless of what the peer review says, as long as the peer reviews are also published alongside the preprints themselves. Or they can retract it and edit it in accordance with the peer reviews. So those 3 preprints, the ones that had a documentary tied to them, one about ritualistic burial in Homo naledi, another on art in Homo naledi, and a third arguing that you don't need a big brain to do those previous 2, those preprints are sitting now published on eLife with 11 peer reviews alongside them, 10 of which are negative. The first of these papers, the one that we're going to be talking about today, titled Evidence for Deliberate Burial of the Dead by Homo naledi by Berger and colleagues here in eLife, is currently up and listed as reviewed preprint, not revised. And you can click on this and it'll take you to a little link that says this reviewed preprint includes the author's original preprint without revision, an eLife assessment, public reviews, and a provisional response from the authors. And then they let you read about eLife's peer review process, which, as I've said previously, works great in theory, but in practice, as we can see here, has some problems. So if we scroll down past the abstract, as I've gone over in previous videos, because I've done this story to death, I've rehashed and relitigated the Homo naledi situation every time new information comes to light, because I love it. The eLife assessment says, the authors study the context of the skeletal remains of 3 individuals and associated sediment samples to conclude that hominin species Homo naledi intentionally buried their dead. Demonstration of the earliest known instance of intentional funerary practice with a relatively small-brained hominin engaging in a highly complex behavior that has otherwise been observed from Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis would be a landmark finding. Yes, it would be. Landmark is bolded here. However, the evidence for these claims is considered inadequate in the current version of the study. The 4 reviewers were in strong consensus that the methods, data, and analyses do not support the primary conclusions. Without full excavation, the study is missing crucial geoarchaeology, especially micromorphology and taphonomic components, amongst other limitations that make premature the conclusion that Homo naledi intentionally buried their dead. The null hypothesis must be that these skeletons accumulated naturally, and the research must then reject the null hypothesis and robustly exclude equifinality in order to justifiably draw the remarkable conclusions made in the present version of this paper. And this happened for the art paper and also the last paper on, you don't need a big brain to do these behaviors, although I think the last paper was the one that had the single positive review, if memory serves. I could be incorrect on that. And then, things just kind of kept getting worse. One of the first citations here in Berger's initial burial paper, and when I say Berger, I mean Berger and colleagues. Lee Berger as an individual is not solely responsible for the paper as it currently stands or the decisions surrounding it. And I've met Lee, and he's a really nice guy. This is strictly about the science here, as I hope is clear. But one of his first citations is Martin Torres here. This is the citation that Lee uses to actually make the case that Homo naledi buried its dead. They cite the methodology and the sort of checklist that Martin Torres and colleagues present in their 2021 paper that's here's what a site needs to meet the bare minimum to be considered a burial, right? It has to check all of these boxes, and then it might be an intentional burial, as opposed to, as we read in the eLife assessment, the null hypothesis, which is just natural accumulation. Martin Torres is the go-to for this, an authority, and Berger recognizes this, which is why Martin Torres is cited so many times in this paper, and indeed twice in the second paragraph and once in the first. So when I say things got worse, this is what I mean. The first full response paper to this set of preprints, outside of the published peer reviews, is titled No Scientific Evidence that Homo naledi Buried Their Dead and Produced Rock Art. And the first author is Martin Torres. The first author is the authority that Lee cites to support his claim.
That sucks. That's,
Now, here's something absolutely critical that I think gets missed a lot in conversations about Homo naledi burial. And that's that all of the peer reviews, all of the negative peer reviews, and all of the response papers, including this one by Martin Yon Torres and the other one that we're going to go over here today, all of those responses are very, very clear about the fact that they don't propose that Homo naledi didn't bury its dead. What they're not saying is that Berger and colleagues are definitively wrong and Homo naledi didn't bury its dead and the null hypothesis is robustly supported. This is a natural accumulation. What all of them are saying, and I think they're pretty clear about this, is that currently we cannot say with confidence that Homo naledi did bury its dead, that there is no support for that claim, that the proper tests have not been carried out, and that there are issues with the methodologies that have been. To put it bluntly, maybe Homo naledi was burying its dead, or at least deliberately disposing of them, but we can't say that because the proper analyses have not been carried out. That's what everybody who's been involved with this on the negative side of things has been saying, and today's paper is no exception. This paper today by Folk, Quafleck, and Pickering, and I hope I'm saying that right, is titled No Sedimentological Evidence for Deliberate Burial by Homo naledi, a case study highlighting the need for best practices in geochemical studies within archaeology and paleoanthropology, and thank goodness this thing is open access, so we're just gonna work our way through it. Does that sound good? Really quick here, I'm just going to be transparent on what I think is going on with Homo naledi, just so you know where I stand moving forward, so I don't just sit here and critique other people's work and not risk putting my own opinions out there. Although I have stated before what I think in previous videos, and my opinion hasn't changed. I think the Homo naledi situation is weird, and I don't think I'm the only person that thinks that. It's weird that it's the only thing in that cave system, and it's weird that the variation is so low. The previous video that I have on this channel covering Homo naledi is on the most recent bizarre paper assessing the variation in the teeth that seems to suggest that all of these members of Homo naledi are just really low in variation. They might even be all members of one sex, or they might be a part of a really closely related, maybe super inbred family. It's super duper weird, and it just adds to the mystery with regard to what's going on with Homo naledi. So here's what I think is going on. I think the cave has been reworked. I've said that in previous videos. There was a poster at the ABAs years ago that was sort of provisionally looking at that possibility. And I think that this thing used to be open to the sky a little bit more, and I think Homo naledi was chucking their dead in. I think they were deliberately disposing of them, but probably not, or at least not in a way that we can investigate, in a ritualistic fashion. I think their dead stink, and I think they live in a single area and don't want to attract predators, and so I think they chuck their dead into the hole, and that's why Homo naledi is almost the only thing in there. That's why they look like they've sort of been jostled about by intermittent flooding, which is common in these karstic caves in South Africa. But that's still really cool, and there's still so much mystery surrounding that as an idea and surrounding the weird low variation of Homo naledi here, and were Homo naledi in other places? In South Africa? Were they elsewhere? Or was this truly a last vestige? Is that why the variation is so low? There are a lot of really cool open questions to ask. I just don't think that those questions surround deliberate burial, shimmying in here with their dead all trussed up in cordage and digging a hole and putting their dead in there and then drawing pictures on the wall. I don't think that that's what's going on. And again, I've said that in previous videos. I'm just kind of letting you guys know that my position hasn't changed, and it's mostly just because I think deliberate disposal is the best way to make sense of the fact that it's virtually just Homo naledi in there. I don't think a predator cache can do that. I don't think a flood can do that. It's possible, and I don't think that this has been sufficiently investigated, so I think this would be a good route of inquiry here. Maybe it was a mass kill. It was a kill site, and a bunch of Homo naledi just happened to be in the area, and there was some kind of disaster that got them all at the same time, and that's why they're the only thing in there. But I kind of can't figure how that would happen in a limestone cave, right? I don't think a landslide is going to funnel them all into this singular location. I think it's pretty unlikely that they would all fall in the hole at the same time. So I'm having trouble with the kill site idea just because I don't know what type of disaster would place them there. So to me, the deliberate disposal makes the most sense. But wouldn't you know it, I'm willing to change my mind if new information comes to light. So speaking of that, let's dig into this newest paper. So if I had to describe this paper in one word, I think the word I would use would be intense, and you're going to see what I mean here in a second. So Folk and colleagues begin with the abstract here, and we will as well. In mid-2023, a preprint was uploaded by some of the team working at the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa on new finds regarding the hominin Homo naledi. The authors reported what they claim is evidence for deliberate burials by a small-brained species and conducted extensive media engagement, presenting this claim to the public, including a Netflix documentary that further amplified the claims made in the preprint. So in case it's not obvious, the only one of the preprints that these guys are going over is the first one. So we're not covering art, we're not covering brain case size and in relation to cognitive function or anything like that. We're just looking at the burials. Subsequently, almost unanimously negative publicly available peer reviews argued that the evidence presented is incomplete and inadequate to support the claims made. The authors are yet to fully address all of the issues raised in the peer reviews. Here we present a detailed critical assessment and reanalysis of the geochemical and sedimentological data used by the authors as a cornerstone of their assertion. We find that both the theory and experimental design are not supported by the realities of the sedimentary environment and violate all prerequisites for conducting such a study. The authors do not meet minimum reporting standards for their geochemical methods, a problem stretching back to 2015 through the published material from this research team. Based on the available information, we surmise that there are likely missteps in data acquisition and quantification, leading to inaccurate final data values. We found deep structural issues with data analysis, visualization, and interpretation, in addition to mischaracterization and misapplication of statistical methods in assessing data. We show that even if the data provided accurately represent the composition of the samples, when analyzed according to field standards, the same data do not support the interpretations, conclusions, and claims made by the authors. We demonstrate that there is insufficient sampling and structured variation in the datasets to allow detection of any difference between the proposed burial features and surrounding sediment. Indeed, all sample groups fully overlap in composition. We believe that the preprint represents an example of where data analysis has been heavily influenced by a presupposed narrative. In the interest of providing broader utility to the archaeological and paleoanthropological community, we offer here an overview of best practices in geochemical data collection and handling for conducting such a study. In conclusion, we argue from a sedimentological standpoint that there is no evidence of deliberate burial of Homo naledi remains. So I hope you see what I mean by intense. That's a lot. The impression that I get is that the authors are deeply troubled by the situation at hand, because we have a claim here in Homo naledi, in these preprints, in the documentary, and in the responses or lack thereof to criticism that is not robustly supported. And this is an opinion that is held by many, many professionals, right? Like everybody who's seen what's sort of come out of these preprints, who has expertise in that area, whether we're talking about burials or fire or art, has come out and said, no, we've not met the minimum standard here. And yet, if you look at public perception, people still by and large accept whole cloth the idea that Homo naledi used fire and buried its dead and made art, etc. Because the Rising Star team has done a very good job of getting their narrative out there. And the troubling part, I think, to these authors here is that that narrative isn't supported. Like, aggressively, it's not supported. And I think that would be upsetting to anybody, right? Like, if someone was making claims within your field, within your area of expertise, and you knew that they were not correct, at least not yet, they can't be well supported, I would find that upsetting as well. And so that's where I think the sort of intensity of this paper is coming from, and I kind of can't blame them. So the too long didn't read of this abstract is that everything about the burial paper is wrong, from the methodology to the analysis, and that's pretty inappropriate given there are field standards that should be kind of robustly stuck to and that few people deviate from, which is kind of odd that Berger and colleagues did deviate from them, but they're going to get into this. Folk and colleagues are going to get into this a little bit more in a moment. The introduction kicks us off saying geochemical and sedimentological methods are important tools in the paleosciences. That's a little too close to paleo experts for my taste, but that's okay. Widely used in establishing the context of a past event or formation/disturbance of a site. These analyses are rapidly becoming the standard for the assessment of sedimentary features that may be related to hominin behavior, and they've just got a boatload of citations here, supporting the notion that yes, a solid geochemical and sedimentological analysis is really critical for making the case of a burial, including the investigations of disposal and or burial. And then here they cite Martin and Torres. In June 2023, a preprint was uploaded purporting to show the evidence of deliberate burial by the dead of a small-brained hominin Homo naledi. This work was submitted along with 2 additional preprints to the new peer-reviewed preprint model at eLife, where peer reviews are solicited and made publicly available by the journal. Prior to the completion of the peer review process, the authors presented a press release, the results of which was extensive media coverage of this work. Yes, I actually forgot to mention that. They did a conference, right, that also outlined it before the Netflix documentary and before the peer review process was done. Upon their release several weeks later, the peer reviews and academic response were unanimously negative, or almost unanimously negative, and we have a lot of citations here, including friend of the channel, Flint Dibble's YouTube video. But they note that these negative responses received little publicity. Berger et al. Provided a single author response to all 3 sets of preprint reviews, and in the time since, 1 large-scale peer-reviewed comment and assessment of the 3 preprints has been published, and that's Martin and Torres 2023. That's this paper here. They go on to say, here we present a detailed critical assessment of the application of the geochemical and sedimentological methods used by Berger in their preprints suggesting deliberate burial, which were not addressed in depth by the reviewers, the author response, or the published comment. So they're basically saying, like, we're going to dig in deep just on one aspect of the burial paper. Since Berger and colleagues didn't do it, we're going to really flesh out the issues that we have with that notion, with using that as an argument for deliberate burial. They make a note here that no attempt was made to obtain any additional data or records from the authors. We utilize only the information presented in the preprint, as would be the case in any published study. So, in case you don't know, one of the big things that is important for any published study is that it needs to be replicable. And in order to be replicable, studies need to have the full methodology laid out. If a paper is done correctly, the methodology plus the supplemental information should give you all the information you need to directly replicate their study if you have the data that they have, right? And then they say in bold here, we wish to be clear. This is an assessment of methods, data handling, and interpretation only, and that we do not inherently object to the idea that a small-brained hominin was capable of this type of behavior. So again, we see another emphasis, as we've seen across all of these reviews, across all of these commentary papers, that it might be the case that Homo naledi buried its dead, or was at least capable of burying its dead. That's not the issue at hand here. The issue at hand here is that that case has not been sufficiently made. They say Berger et al. Present 2 separate assemblages of Homo naledi, and then they go on to say that they're going to be looking specifically at the Dinaledi chamber features and not the hill antechamber. Finally, they say that there are 3 arguments that Berger and colleagues use to make the case that in Dinaledi chamber feature 1 presents evidence of a deliberate burial. They say these cases are A, establishing that the skeletal remains are in a pit that was deliberately created based off of field excavation evidence. So basically that the pit that these bones were supposedly found in was intentionally dug out, a body was placed in it, and then there was infill. So that dugout sediment was reincorporated into the pit surrounding the skeleton. They say B, that the positioning and articulation of the skeletal elements support a burial. So there are specific decomposition signals that you could get that burials have that just resting on the surface and rotting doesn't have. And then they say C, the taphonomic assessment of the skeletal remains. So looking at the skeletal remains themselves, how they've actually been preserved, how they're oriented. That's a little bit more of B, but you kind of get the point. They say we focus this critique on the first point and hope other experts in the field will address others in due course. So they're focusing on busting the methodology of one part of one paper. So let's see how that goes. They say that Berger and colleagues argue that their geochemical and sedimentological data establish that the chemistry and lithology within the burial features is different from other areas in the cave, following the approach used for generally accepted burials at Panga Yasadi. Oh, that's the site, Panga Yasadi by Martin Torres in 2021. They say we approach our critique in 3 parts. In section A, we assess the author's analysis and interpretation of the data provided in the preprint with reference to the research question. This includes an attempt to replicate the author's results, and we all know how important that is, the author's results where data are available. In section B, we assess whether the methodologies and experimental framework selected by Berger et al. Were appropriate for the research question. And finally, in section C, we assess whether the data acquisition process follows established standards and offer the community a set of best practices for the use of these methods in this context from a scientific standpoint. So they're sort of doing like an inverted pyramid here, right? They're starting with the analysis and the interpretation and sort of picking that apart. Then they're backing up and critiquing the methodology and experimental design itself. And then finally, they're backing up further and saying, if we were to sort of design a study, here's the tools that would be available for this kind of thing. Here's what Berger and colleagues have at their disposal and kind of what we recommend they should do moving forward. So I don't want to just sit here and read the paper to you. I want to offer sort of my own thoughts and synthesize the paper as a whole as we go along. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to go with section A and section B, and then I'm going to reference section C where applicable. So remembering our inverted pyramid here, we're starting with section A, a critique of data presentation, analysis, and interpretation. So they start by saying that Berger et al. Structured their research question regarding the identification of intentional burial after Martin Torres et al. In 2021. So remember, Martin Torres, this is the one who's the lead on this. She's not exactly a fan of how her 2021 work was handled by Berger and colleagues, but I digress. In theory, a difference in the physical and chemical properties of the sediment between the burial pit and the surrounding area may reflect digging through adjacent strata and incorporating chemically different material from those strata into the pit or fill. So the way that you guys can think of this is that you have this sediment plane there in the cave. If Homo naledi comes in there and they dig a pit, right? So they dig down with a rock or some kind of proto shovel, and they pull out all of this sediment, enough sediment to then put a body in, and then they take the sediment that they pulled, which is now jumbled and incorporated, and if you will recall from geology, sediment lays down in layers, right? So these layers are now all jumbled up because they've been dug out and set aside in a pile. The body is placed in, and then now that sediment is reincorporated back into the burial around the bones. That burial pit should have a chemically different and sedimentologically different signal than the surrounding area that has not been disturbed. One, because it's been all mixed up, all the strata have been stirred up and incorporated into one another. And then two, that mixture has now been put around a body that is going to leach new chemicals like to and from the surrounding sediment. This means theoretically you could sample the sediment in the burial pit and then compare it to sediment sampled from sterile, non-burial pit areas, and those two things should differ in meaningful ways that match expectations established from other sites' known burial pit versus sterile areas. A simple promise. Berger et al. Collected geochemical data from the areas surrounding Feature 1 to demonstrate that Feature 1 fits the definition of a deliberately created pit. Okay, so that's what they're saying. The authors used previously published petrographic analyses, including mineralogy, chemistry, and texture analysis, and newly collected particle size distribution, PSD, and X-ray fluorescence, XRF, data as the basis for their sedimentological and geochemical assessment of this feature. We focus primarily on their XRF data with some discussion of the PSD data. Berger et al. In their supplementary table 1 provide the weight percent oxide values for 12 major elements analyzed by XRF for each sediment sample, and then in their supplementary table 2 present measures or values, for mean skewness and kurtosis, that's their PSD data for each sediment sample. In this section, we will assess their analysis, presentation, and interpretation of these two data sets in reference to their research question. So basically what Berger and colleagues did is they sampled the pit, they sampled areas that are outside of the pit, and they used X-ray fluorescence, and particle size distribution to make the case that the pit itself is different enough from the surrounding areas and different enough in a way that matches what our expectations would be for a burial, to propose Homo naledi dug the pit, put their dead in there, and then buried it. And what these guys are going to do, what folk et al. Are going to do here, is they're going to critique the analysis itself and see what they think. So the authors next talk about how Berger and colleagues used a PCA, or a principal component analysis, to analyze their XRF, or X-ray fluorescence, data. They say that PCA is an exploratory method through which to present and analyze multidimensional data. And that's true. So you might be out there and you're like, I don't know what a PCA is. And you might not, but you've definitely seen a PCA before. So allow me to explain in brief here. So this is a principal component analysis little graph figure here that you can see on your screen from biostatsquid.com. And we've got two principal components that are shown here, PC1 on the x-axis and PC2 on the y. And then what you see here are a bunch of people who are plotted on this graph, where we've got older people in blue and younger people in orange, and then we have a color gradient of people who might be in between. And we've got these three clusters here, and this is the age at which they died. So BiostatSquid kind of fleshes this out a little bit more, but what they've done here is they've run a principal component analysis on a variety of different variables. So in this example, they're trying to figure out if there's a pattern that can be recognized between a bunch of different factors like smoking, cholesterol, exercise, and the age at which people died. But the problem is, if you want to visualize the impact of one variable on the other, you're kind of limited to 3 dimensions, really. Most graphs are 2-dimensional, right, at x and y, but you can do 3-dimensional ones too that incorporate the z-axis, although I personally don't like them very much. So the solution for this is to take that multi-dimensional data and simplify, if you will, the dimensionality of it. So that's what a PCA does. It takes a bunch of different dimensions and it reduces the dimensionality while maintaining the maximum amount of information. So these principal components are what you're kind of left with. And the principal components are sort of phrased in a way that explains the variation. So it might be like, oh, PCA 1 explains 50% of the variation in these clusters. It explains 50% of the reason. It explains 50% of the variability amongst these clusters. To put it really simply, it's a powerful visualization tool when you have a lot of variables but want to put it in a way that's sort of comprehensible. And that's what the authors point out here, right? They state, let me fix my OBS here so you can actually see it. They state, with regard to the principal component analysis, that this analysis is useful in capturing the variation within data sets with high numbers of attributes per data point. So in the case of the people that we were just looking at, right, we looked at a bunch of people plotted, but each of them have a value or a score for their cholesterol and their exercise per week and their height and whether they smoked or not and things like that. A PCA utilizes a mathematical transformation to reduce the high number of dimensions or attributes per data point into a more accessible number of dimensions while retaining as much of the original information as possible. PCA is commonly utilized in geochemical analysis, where data for many chemical elements is collected for each sample. So this makes sense, right? So think of our person analysis here, our person comparison, and instead of looking at people and plotting the age at which they died and taking into consideration all of these different factors of their lifestyle, now we're looking at geochemical samples of dirt taken from the cave, and the variables that we're looking at are elements, the presence of particular elements or the amount of particular elements within that sample. And we're trying to figure out if there's a relationship between the composition of each sample and whether it's a burial or not, whether it was in the burial pit or not, the location of it on the floor of the cave. Berger et al. In their supplementary material listed the elemental oxide data as obtained by the XRF. So that's just what they found, the percent of each element within each sample as a raw percentage. The reader should note that standard procedure would be centered around a log ratio transform data, and then they cite Aitchison and Greenacre from 2002. So basically, Berger's reporting it as a percentage, but you should report it as log transformed data. So log transformation is important because it reduces the skew of the data. I do it a lot because I work with ratios with sexual dimorphism, and primates also vary a lot in their group size and in their body size. So I recognize that it's pretty important to do, and it's kind of odd that they didn't. These values were used in their PCA analysis to assess the variation between samples. Berger et al. Also only utilize major elements to assess differences between sediments, yet it is well established that trace elements are more useful for discriminating between sediments. And then they've got a host of citations here. So Berger and colleagues didn't treat the data correctly, they didn't log transform it, and they assessed the wrong aspect of the data, focusing on major elements instead of minor elements. They see two of the elements reported by the authors, sodium and sulfur, appear to lack measurements for nearly all samples, despite the interpretation of the results directly relying on at least sulfur. So I'm not a geochemistry expert, and when I read this from Folk and colleagues, I was like, all right, I'm pulling up the paper, I'm gonna go see what Berger and friends actually had to say and sort of start to tease this apart, and it's not good, you guys. So if you scroll down past the introduction and some of the first figures here, you're going to get to the figures that Folk and colleagues were talking about, and you get to the principal component analysis. So here in the body, they talk about the PCA that they ran. It yielded 3 principal components, or at least like major ones: PC1, PC2, and PC3. So PC1 here is supposed to be able to distinguish between the presence of calcified sediment versus uncalcified sediment. PC2 is our critical one. This is supposed to be able to distinguish between sterile sediments and fossil-bearing sediments. So theoretically on PC2, you should see like the burial site as a cluster and then non-burial sites, non-fossil-bearing areas as a cluster. And then PC3 is supposed to distinguish between 2 types of sediment, again, LORM versus the UMCB. And we're going to come back to PC3 and PC1, but obviously, I think that's clear. PC2, this is our money shot. This is our important principal component. And here's what Berger and colleagues have to say specifically about PC2 and its importance. They say PC2 describes only 8% variability with a dominance of silicon, phosphorus, and sulfur in the positive direction versus all other elements, but mainly magnesium and iron in the negative axis. PC2 distinctly delineates fossil-bearing sediments from sterile sediments based off of the positive loadings of phosphorus and sulfur, which we assume to be proxies of the fossil bones. For example, around Reanalysis feature 2, PC2 shows that the floor sediment collected during the excavation that uncovered the feature has sterile areas with no positive loadings of phosphorus and sulfur, and fossil-bearing areas have positive loadings of phosphorus and sulfur. While different from the surrounding sediment of PC2, the infill of the feature resembles the composition of other parts of Reanalysis subsystems and the Lassetti chamber where remains of Homo naledi have been unearthed. So they're like the infill here, the fossil-bearing sediment, looks like fossil-bearing sediment elsewhere, but that in and of itself doesn't show that everything is a burial. It just shows that the areas that bear fossils look similar, whether or not they were buried or washed in or chunked in. So remember, phosphorus and sulfur are supposed to be the 2 elements that primarily distinguish between fossil-bearing areas and non-fossil-bearing areas, or as this paper argues, the burial pit and non-burials. Right? So here we see on PC2, these elements here, like aluminum, these are in the negative, iron, magnesium, whereas the ones that are loaded positively and supposedly indicate fossil presence are phosphorus, sulfur, silicon, and a very small amount of titanium. But if we go back to Folk and colleagues' paper here, they see 2 of the elements reported by the authors, sodium and sulfur, appear to lack measurements for nearly all samples, despite the interpretation of the results relying directly on at least sulfur. So for the fossil versus non-fossil sediments, sulfur and phosphorus are supposed to drive it, but we have almost no sulfur, period. That's really weird. I don't really know what to make of that. They say some measurements are lacking for barium and 1 for each titanium and phosphorus. 1 each for titanium and phosphorus, rather. This is noted as a dash in their supplementary table 1. It's unclear what this notation indicates other than a lack of data, and it is unclear how these missing data have been incorporated into the calculation of the principal component analysis in MATLAB, since this mathematical transformation requires a complete data set. So you can't actually run the PCA with a dash. It has to be a number. It has to be a numeric value. And so what Folk and colleagues are going to say here is they're going to be like, so we assumed that it meant 0 and we put a 0 in. And they note that when they assume that the dash means 0, and this is displayed here in figure 1, where the light blue indicates Berger et al.'s results, the sort of like tealish color, I don't know if that's teal, the sort of darker blue is this study's replication attempt, and then they run a new analysis that you can see here in orange. And for figure 1, you can see that when they assume a 0 for the dash, it's pretty close to Berger's results, right? Like there are a couple of minor differences, like titanium here in D versus E is a little higher in their study versus Berger's. That shouldn't happen. You should be able to get the exact numbers that a study got if you replicate it, if you're explaining your methods correctly. That's like just proper reporting. And then what they say is basically like, yeah, we could replicate it if we assume 0 for the dash, but that's not even appropriate because you shouldn't be assuming a dash or a 0 anyways. There's a standard recommendation for this situation in data analysis. Data with more than 10% of the values missing, which here would include sodium and sulfur, should be removed from the analysis entirely. For rare values missing less than 10% in a column, the standard method in compositional analysis would be to replace the missing values with 55% LOD, the limit of detection, as advised by Martin Fernandez et al. In 2003. This approach is commonly used in archaeological and sedimentological research. However, it does not appear to have been implemented in Berger et al. 2023. Because PCA cannot be performed with missing data, it is possible that the dash is substituted for 0 under the assumption that there is very little or none of that element in the sample. And then they go on to say, we assumed 0 there instead. So to make a long story short, this, again, in light blue is Berger's analysis. The darker blue is assuming a 0 for where dashes were. And then orange is the proper methodology following, like, established methods. And you can just see how different the orange is from the light blue and the dark blue. Like, if you run Berger's analysis with appropriate methods, you get different results. And that's not good. But as we already pointed out here, the authors elaborate, like Folk et al. Elaborate at the top of this next section. They say that they were not actually able, they say our results replicate the loading plot for PC1, but they weren't able to replicate the most important plot, PC2, shown in their figure 3G and figure 7. Our loading plot for PC2, remember that's fossil bearing versus non-fossil bearing, is shown in figure 1E. Our analyses do not replicate the author's proportions of variance explained by each PC. Berger et al. Report that their PC1 explains 51% of total variance and PC2 8%. In our analysis of these data, we find that PC1 explains 33% and PC2 22%, a result reproduced by another package. Using MATLAB, like as Berger did with a dash in place of 0, the PC function returns PC1 at 80% and PC2 at 21% for unscaled data. Based on our ability to replicate only a part of what is presented due to insufficient explanation of the process and a lack of script, we conclude that the authors assumed a value of 0 with their missing data and can only deduce that the data must have been scaled in some unexplained way. Otherwise, the loading of silicon on PC1 is very large, and this is not what was reported. We suspect that this may reflect the author's unexplained use of the function core-plot, correlated plot, I guess. The data correlations were implemented with the function of core-plot, which uses a Pearson's correlation coefficient. We were unable to determine for what purpose this function would be used in relation to this study. We believe that such use is likely either unnecessary or incorrect. All of these data analysis decisions should have been explained in the text along with measurement parameters that led to these decisions. To continue our analysis of this dataset, we utilized our analysis in R that best replicated the parts of the results reported by Berger, so that's that dark blue color. We also compared the author's results and interpretation to our reanalysis using the recommended standard procedure. So, like, to sum things up, right, the methodology wasn't correct, but even when you can closely replicate their methodology, you can't get their results. That's bad, I would say. So if you're like me, you might be wondering what that means, right? Their PC2 actually explained more variance than Berger and colleagues' PC2, whether we're looking at their replication or their reanalysis, the dark blue or the orange. And my understanding, again, of this, and I'm no expert, is that, once again, PC2 is just explaining the difference, like chemically speaking, between fossil-bearing sediment and non-fossil-bearing sediment. I would expect, even as a layman, that fossil-bearing sediment should look different than non-fossil-bearing sediment. I think the question here is, can that distinguishing factor also be applied to burial versus non-burial? And we're going to touch on that a little bit more here in a second. They go on to say, we wish to make some brief comments on data presentation with regard to the use and reporting of PCA. Berger et al. State that PCA is the standard method for unmixing mixed variables, and that's a quote that they give. This appears to be a direct and uncited quote from 2017 in April from a blog post describing for students the process of using PCA with MATLAB. This quote is an incorrect way to describe what PCA does. PCA is used for dimensionality reduction. PCA is primarily a data visualization and data exploration method in which the data are mathematically transformed into new coordinate systems with fewer dimensions than the initial dataset. It allows for the identification of clusters and drivers of that variation in the dataset. It does not unmix mixed variables. So, yikes. In addition, the plot style, I mentioned this earlier, but only because I've read this paper before, that Berger et al. Utilized for presenting the PC scores of all the samples appears to come from the same blog post. This is a non-standard way to plot PC scores and doesn't help the reader understand the data. It's incorrect and misleading, yikes, in bold, to use a continuous line plot to connect discrete sample scores. Score plots are almost always displayed as 2D or 3D plots using 2 or 3 PCs superimposed with 95% confidence ellipses to maximize the portion of the total variation that the data can be displayed and leads to the most accurate interpretation. So, this is how PCs are normally displayed, and this looks remarkably similar to the example that I showed you, although, like with the humans and the age of death, although that didn't have the 95% confidence ellipses, so these ellipses basically just, capture all the points that are related to that, and then also expounds. That's compared to what Berger and colleagues did here in figure 7a, which has the PC2 score on the Y and the sample number here on the X. That's really weird. And as the authors folk et al. Talk about, right, it's kind of misleading as to the importance of that principal component. It sort of inflates it artificially. So they go on to talk a little bit more about that. They say Berger et al. Interpret the plot one PC at a time. Unless a dataset is overwhelmingly driven by a single variable, one PC is insufficient to capture the variation of a dataset. Fallaciously, if a dataset is overwhelmingly driven by a single variable, PCA is a poor choice for visualization and assessment anyways, right? And anyways is my addition. The standard way to display the data presented by Berger et al. Is shown in our figure 2. So we have here our A and B, specifically with their replication in A and their reanalysis in B. And as you can see, they are a little bit different. And also notably, they overlap a lot. And that should be concerning if you're Berger and colleagues. So here we get to some important stuff and call back to the difference between their results for PC2 in both their reanalysis and in their replication versus Berger and colleagues. They say that Berger and colleagues primarily utilize PC2 from their PCA to argue that there is a difference in the sediment chemistry between the purported burial feature and the surrounding sediment. Though we were not able to exactly replicate their loadings in both their and our analysis, PC2 in the positive direction is driven primarily by silicon, and then, in the order of absolute loading, by phosphorus, sulfur, and titanium. Importantly, sulfur is only reported for 8 samples, none of which are from the Reanalysis chamber. The authors argue that these 4 elements are useful to distinguish fossil-bearing sediment from sterile sediment. This may or may not be an accurate conclusion. There's not enough information about the sediment or fossil material properties to determine if specific elements represent a fossiliferous signal exclusively. For example, this is the kicker. It is well known that phosphorus and sulfur are very common in organic sediments or can be inherited from the decay of organic matter present in the sediments or soils. In addition, studies have shown that bat guano in caves very rich in sulfur and phosphorus that is very rich in phosphorus and sulfur. Multiple scenarios could be responsible for the higher percentage loadings for these elements in the Reanalysis chamber samples. So even though their PC2 explained a higher amount of variability, their argument here is sort of softly pitching that, that's not because we're looking at a burial versus a non-burial. We haven't achieved equifinality there, and that's a problem. They say it should be noted that none of the samples taken from feature 1, which contains fossils, or the area around it apparently contain any sulfur, further calling into question this element as a distinguishing factor. So, to be very clear, Berger and colleagues argued that sulfur and phosphorus can distinguish fossil-bearing sediment from non-fossil-bearing sediment. And like feature 1 was their main case to make in their burial paper. But these guys are noting here, Folk and colleagues are noting here, that according to their supplementary material, feature 1 doesn't contain any sulfur. The burial pit doesn't contain like the element that is supposed to distinguish burials from non-burials. That's very weird, isn't it? It doesn't make a lot of sense for fossiliferous sediment in this system. They say in our reanalysis, PC2 does account for the majority of the separation between feature 1 and the areas around it. However, when plotted against PC1, this separation is minimal. So that's the problem, right? So they had a greater amount of variation than Berger and colleagues explained by PC2 versus Berger and them's 8%. They have quite a bit more. But the separation isn't that clear. So here in A and B, the reanalysis in B and the replication in A, we do not see clear clustering here. Not in the slightest. Certainly not enough to make the case. And this is emphasized in the body, of course, where Folk and colleagues bold and say there is no indication that there is sufficient structured variation in this dataset to even ask whether or not feature 1 is different from anything else. And this is amongst other issues that they don't even really go that hard on. They talk about a section over here where there were samples taken, like dug down a little bit past the surface. They say locality SA separates the best with still overlap with other localities. So SA is specifically, I believe, in purple here. No, it's in pink. So SA is the pink area in A and B here. And they say that their supplemental, so Berger and colleagues, supplemental material shows the location of these samples, and a lot of them come from the present-day floor surface, but SA2, SA4, and SA5 are taken from some depth below the surface. That depth is not specified, and these samples do not cluster well with the rest of the SA group. So we just don't know really precisely where they're pulled from, and they also don't group with the other members of its category, which is kind of bizarre and doesn't make a lot of sense. They say, notice the large difference between samples SA2A and SA2B, subsamples of the same spot. This indicates that there may be large variation within samples and within localities. The authors even note something bizarre under that bolded section I mentioned earlier. They say, interestingly, we note that in the supplementary information, Berger et al. State that, quote, there are no characteristic differences with all the major elements and loss on ignition, LOI, in terms of concentration range and averages in the geochemistry of the sediments sampled from inside feature 1, the sterile area around feature 1, and the sediments removed above feature 1. That statement runs counter to what is presented in the main text. That is just so weird. That is so weird that was included in the supplementary material, but they still moved forward with the conclusions they moved forward with in the body of the text. So then Folk and colleagues run an additional analysis, right? They tweak things again using only specific samples that are directly related to the excavations of feature 1. Again, that specific burial pit in Reanalysis, and they say that they have even less of a discrimination than they previously had. We find the differentiation between feature 1 and the surrounding material to be even less pronounced in this analysis. In both test cases, PC1 and PC2 explain 33% of the variation. The samples from within feature 1, so within the burial pit, span the ellipses of all other groups, and they kind of conclude by this saying, per our exhaustive analysis of the data provided, regardless of whether or not its acquisition was methodologically sound, there is no indication that this method of geochemical measurement in any way supports the conclusions of the authors. All data and commented code for all analyses are provided in our supplementary information. So to summarize this section, the methodology that Berger and colleagues used was incorrect, and there are a lot of citations that Folk and colleagues present to make that case. And as you add correct methodological steps to Berger and colleagues' analysis, the results get further and further and further away from what Berger and colleagues propose they say, right? Like you get less and less of a clear discrimination between fossiliferous sediment and non-fossiliferous sediment, like the burial pit and other areas. What that would suggest is not that a group of Homo naledi shimmied their way into the cave and dug a hole and put the body in and then buried it, and you get these sort of hot spots of geochemical signals that indicate burials versus non-burials, but there's like bodies all over the place because they're either being chunked in or washed in, or however you want to explain their presence in the cave, and that's sort of leading to this pattern that we're seeing that isn't as discrete as Berger and colleagues kind of need it to be, if that makes sense. That's my understanding of this. Folk and colleagues critique the particle size data as well, and we could go through this, but I think it could be summarized pretty well by one sentence here, where they basically talk about how the same mistake is made as with the XRF. Instead, the authors present their results as a single figure showing the mean of the distribution of polymodal samples, making the same error as with the XRF results. Discrete samples are being connected with a continuous line. Again, this is misleading because there is no stratigraphic order between these samples. The samples taken within feature 1 contribute to the variability of the samples in the cave. Nothing more can be drawn from the data. And then they say that the caption of figure S13 asserts that patterns can be seen in grain size through the in situ stratigraphy, but as explained above, the variation of the mean of the distribution between bi, tri, and polymodal sediment is a meaningless metric. I'm mostly reading this to you to point out that it's like you can kind of dismiss the particle size data because it's made the same mistakes as the XRF, but by all means, this is open access, so please go read it if you want to learn a little bit more. In section B, we get the critical assessment of the research framework. They say that in section A, we demonstrated the XRF and PSD data as provided by Berger et al. Does not support their conclusions when analyzed using standard techniques or are not reported completely, impeding replication. In this section, we assess in detail whether the author's methodological framework was appropriate for this application. So, was what they did even appropriate? Like, what they did was wrong, but was what they did at least right in theory? The answer, as you will find out, as argued by Folk et al., is no. As outlined previously, the author's objective is to demonstrate a chemical or lithological difference between the sediment within feature 1 and the sediment surrounding it, under the assumption that such a difference would reflect deliberate digging through adjacent strata and incorporating chemically different material from those strata into the pit or fill. In theory, this would support deliberate burial of the remains rather than natural accumulation. The narrative of deliberate body disposal predates this paper and has been critiqued elsewhere before. But Dirks et al. In 2016 do go on to state that they recognize that the mass mortality of a group of hominin within the Dinwiddie chamber due to a death trap scenario is possible, unquote, but that this hypothesis has not been carried forward. Rather, the 2015 deliberate disposal narrative morphed into one of deliberate burial in the 2023 preprints. So this is kind of what I was getting at earlier, right? This idea that initially it was a disposal hypothesis, and I think a lot of folks were amicable towards that idea, or at least like receptive towards testing it. And what the authors here point out is that it's like that idea was never actually in and of itself tested against like the death trap hypothesis, right? Which would be an example of a natural accumulation. I explained why I don't like necessarily feel that the death trap hypothesis has a lot going for it earlier, but they are correct that it was never actually like tested. We didn't achieve equifinality here, and that is bad. So the authors here propose that you have to have some minimum prerequisites before you can actually move forward towards the analysis. So like I said, inverted pyramids, we're at stage 2 now, we're looking at the study design. And they say, we propose that the logical prerequisites for investigating deliberate burial using these methods are, at minimum, number 1, the presence of non-homogeneous structured stratigraphy in the archaeological site at large. So you need a non-homogeneous structured stratigraphy across the entire site so you can actually compare and contrast specific regions with consistency. 2, they say lateral exposure and assessment of stratigraphic continuity surrounding the proposed pit or pit feature. So you need to actually have a side view of what's going on here. Now this thing has not been entirely dug out, so we don't need that. And 3, complete sampling and assessment of a depth profile near the feature, including some distance above and below the proposed pit. So you need to have like a full survey, a full suite of like, we have the pit, we have the samples at various levels within the pit, and then we have this area with like sterile sediment next to it, and we have the same, if not more, samples that characterize that. So you have a full profile of what the pit is characterized by versus what the non-pit areas are characterized by. This would be necessary to demonstrate that between strata variation is greater than within stratum variation. In this section, we will demonstrate that not only does this work presented by Berger et al. Not meet the minimum methodological standards for this type of analysis, but also violates each of these prerequisites for carrying out such a study. So in the stratigraphic analysis, that's not a great way to start, obviously, but in the stratigraphic analysis here, they give a brief history of the Rising Star cave system, and I'm going to skip down to this line here because I think it's helpful. Very simply summarized, the cave deposits, I think it says deposits here, the cave deposit consists of internally derived authigenic secondary carbonate, so those are speleotherms, and allochthonous externally derived clastic sediments. For those of you out there who aren't geologists, what you need to know from this little section here is that a lot of these karstic cave systems in South Africa are characterized by the same traits. They all look pretty similar. They're these limestone cave systems that periodically flood and then are periodically exposed, and that seems to be how all of them are. They say the majority of these cave systems have been subject to considerable surface weathering as well and erosion through time, and as a result, we currently see the roots of much larger cave systems exposed at the surface. Rising Star is in the minority in that the fossil-bearing deposits are still underground in a deep and complex karst system. Since the discovery of Homo naledi fossils within the system, these sediments have been the subject of much investigation. So they talk about how there's been work on sedimentology, geochemistry, and dating, and they have quite a few good citations here. We have the dates, but what's important to note, and this is something that I kind of just learned talking to some folks over the summer, but this date range here, which I think I said 335 to 236, but here it says 241 to 335. It's done by work on flowstones, but apparently they say that some unpublished debate exists in the field over these conclusions. And I've heard this from people too, so I guess there are some folks that feel that the dating might not be as solid as it's been characterized as. So, Berger should be excited about that. Maybe it is early Homo. It's probably not. We also note that there's no consensus on the proposed history of the cave configuration. Berger et al. Imply the antiquity of the inaccessibility of the Naledi chamber, which is indeed central to their argument for deliberate burial through the cave system as we see it today. That's really critical, right? Berger and colleagues maintain that it is difficult to get to and has always been this difficult to get to, meaning the only way for Naledi to get back there is with things like fire, and that means it would have been capable of things like art and cordage, evidently. He's never officially made the cordage claim, but it was in his documentary, so I can't help but feel that he feels that way, right? Like it was included in the animation. They say, however, members of their own team argue that clastic sediments entered the cave through an opening in the roof of the postbox chamber from about 600,000 years ago onward, until the opening was choked by coarse breccia blocks, probably sometime after 180,000 years ago. Depositional and erosional events changed the internal morphology of the cave chambers over time, and thereby changed the access route into Dinaledi chamber, where the bulk of Homo naledi fossils were found. And then they say Robbins et al. In 2021 present compelling evidence that Rising Star cave system has undergone changes through time, and the Dinaledi chamber has not always been as inaccessible as it is now, and that through that time window during which Homo naledi bones were being deposited here, there was an opening in the roof. I would like credit for my completely uninformed musings of like, hey, maybe there was another entrance. And just, it's because I'm so smart. This next section is kind of weird. So folk et al. Say that the role of water in accumulating and reworking the sediments within Rising Star specifically now is unclear. Dirks et al. In 2015, argued strongly that the fine-grained nature of sediments in the presence of matrix indicate that water played little part in the sediment accumulation. However, they also argued that some of the fossils had been deposited within the cave and that their positioning, both horizontal and not, suggests a burial history involving multiple geogenic events. Dirks 2015 then used mineral staining on the bones as further evidence of reworking, erosion, and redeposition within the cave. The presence alone of flowstones suggests periods of increased precipitation outside of the cave. The sediments of Unit 2 and 3 contain multiple intercalated flowstones. I hope I'm saying that right, intercalated. Dirks 2015 observed periods of erosion and slumping of the deposits, especially Unit 2, in between flowstone accumulation, leading to the sediment of Unit 2 being reworked and spread out along the floor of Dinaledi chamber. The agent of this reworking is not specified, but it is difficult to evoke anything other than water, especially given that water-laying deposits have been documented to be present within the cave by Berger's own analysis. Dirks et al. 2017 focused on dating the deposits and fossils, as well as refining their stratigraphy and recognizing subunits within Unit 1 and 3. Therein, they argue that all fossils are found in subunit 3b and that these sediments were reworked and redistributed across the cave floor. So, what exactly is the position of the team, right, with regard to the role of water? I guess, much like Folk et al. Say here, it's unclear. In bold, they say, we argue that the geological configuration within this cave system is not compatible with a deep, well-defined, and well-characterized stratigraphy within which to discern a disturbance in burial, thus violating prerequisite 1 listed above for the utilization of these methods. In addition, the lack of a clear standard presentation of the cave stratigraphy, both in detailed cross-section and global geomorphological transects in this and in previous publication, complicates our ability to understand the context of any analyses conducted. Folk et al. Talk a little bit about the fact that the whole thing wasn't excavated, and they do understand why that wasn't done, but that because of that, prerequisite 2 is not really met, and so you can't really go forward with the analysis that they already covered in Section A or Section 1. And then they go on to discuss the LORM. Let me tell you about the LORM. LORM stands for Light Orange-Red Mudstone, and it is this band that exists in the stratigraphy, or is argued to exist in the stratigraphy of the cave. And it's found specifically, in this Dinaledi Feature 1, and Berger and colleagues argued that the LORM, this band, is broken where the burial is, and then it's like mixed up within the rest of the sediment at deeper and more high up levels than it should be, right? And so what that would indicate is that, you dig a hole, you break the LORM layer, pull everything out into that pile, the LORM gets incorporated into the sediment, the body is put in, and then the infill is reapplied, burying the body, and the LORM is all scattered around, mixed in with the rest of the sediment. And there's a problem here. This is figure 3, right, in Berger's paper, the burial paper, and we can see the LORM here. It's indicated with this nice little arrow, and here it's traveling, and then here it's broken up, and my understanding is presumably that this is like part of the pit, and it's kind of like incorporated in. Let's read the summary just so we can know for sure. B is a profile view. Feature 1 occurs within unlithified mud-clast breccia or breccia rich in orange-red clasts. A continuous laminated orange-red mud layer beneath unexcavated floor surface dips near the feature where it becomes fragmented and muddled. So I think I'm fair to say that this is what they're arguing exists like all across the floor as a layer. And then here it is broken up and incorporated into the burial. What is this big black box doing here, covering, a fifth of this entire figure, of this section of the figure? What is this big black box doing here? Why is it containing a scale bar that is this small, and why is it seemingly strategically placed in this location? That's very weird, and I mentioned this the last time I went over it, but this scale bar is much smaller. Why doesn't this one look like this one? This is bizarre, and Folk and colleagues note that this is a weird situation. So moving back to their paper here, they have the following to say. Their figures 3A and 3B show what are claimed to be 2 distinct lithologies in the stratigraphy of the Dinaledi floor. The skeletal remains occur in an unlithified mud-clast breccia, denoted by Berger et al. As UMCB, containing laminated orange-red mud clasts, a continuous laminated orange-red mud, the LORM, layer between the unexcavated floor surface that dips near the feature where it becomes fragmented and muddled, unquote. Their figure 3B shows that the LORM is continuous to the right or the east of the feature, but the left of the feature was either not excavated or not shown. This is it. Figure 3B, the left of the feature is either not excavated or not shown. I'm realizing, there you go. Now you can see the box fully. This is bizarre, right? Here's the LORM traveling. Here's broken up, and you can't see it. It's not shown. I think that's a kind way of putting it. Their figures 3A and 3B appear to be the same view at different points in the excavation process, during which the profile was advanced towards the skeletal material, or skeletal remains, from SB at the same shiny white fragment visible in both photos above the 5 centimeter scale bar in figure 3B. The lorem layer shown in their figure 3B does not appear to be present in their figure 3A, nor does any semblance of structured stratigraphy. They state that, quote, this layer was not noted during our previous excavations where the clasts were reported, but is continuous in profile immediately to the south of, or to the east of the feature, is disrupted in the sediment profile at the southern extent of the feature. There is no mention or illustration of the extent of the lorem layer, which was apparently, quote, continuous, but absent 5 centimeters to the south. So I would concur with this, that this is a very strange demonstration of this continuous layer that is broken and then incorporated into the sediment. They continue and say that in other publications, chiefly Wiersma 2020, the incorporation of the lorem layer into the UMCB is noted to be the result of autobrecciation, a process in which wet-dry cycles cause the cracking and disintegration of the lorem into orange clasts. Then they have in bold, this is described as occurring throughout the cave system in a non-structured way and would call into question the idea that this particular disturbance of the lorem was due to the digging of the pit. So if I'm understanding this correctly, and I don't remember this being in the reviews, so this is a new concept to me and, big if true. What they're saying here is that the lorem looks like that everywhere, that it's periodically autobrecciated and broken up, which would mean that the breaking and incorporation of the lorem means absolutely nothing and is consistent with the rest of the cave. Huh? What? They go on and say, in all previously published work on the area directly adjacent to this feature, such disturbances are pointed to as evidence of ways in which the sediment was naturally reworked in the system. Berger et al. Make no comment on the discrepancy between their description of the lorem and these prior publications. Also relevant to this point is the observation that Berger et al. Appear to have rotated the figure 3D and 3E relative to their orientation in 3C, such that the lamination is oriented horizontally. So they've rotated this to be this, and they've rotated this to be this, to make it look horizontal. I mean, you guys can draw your own conclusions, but I don't really know what to make of that. That's really weird, and it's so weird that Berger's own team talked about this lorem autobrecciation, and they don't even mention it. Like, you would think that if this case was special and was indicative of burial, that they would be like, I know we said that this autobrecciation or brecciation, or however you say it, is different and is consistent in the rest of the cave, but this version is distinct from those and is indicative of burial because of ABC. Something like that. It's bizarre. The orientation of laminations to appear parallel to the floor surface in figure 3B implies an undisturbed sedimentary context where the orientation in reality demonstrates that the sediment had been substantially reworked. This rotation is both unnecessary and misleading. As a final note of the context of this site and under engagement with previous work, we assert that singling out these sets of remains as burials without providing any comparative consideration of the other hominin remains in the Denaledi subsystem seems premature. There is currently no detailed published information on the spatial location or taphonomy, that's the study of how things die and preserve, for the vast majority of these remains. This same issue occurs in the lack of published information on most faunal remains that do occur in the cave, including a juvenile baboon skeleton deeper in the Denaledi subsystem. So my understanding is that it's not a skeleton, but this is new to me. If it is, I'm worried that it's being described as a skeleton here, when previously I've heard it as like, oh, it's like a tooth. Yikes. So then they talk about the sampling strategy. They say in selecting areas to sample for the geochemical analysis of feature 1, the authors do not sample adequately through the stratigraphic profile. They say this degree of sampling would not be sufficient to establish that between strata variation is greater than within strata variation, which would be prerequisite 3 listed above for their research questions. So they've got none out of the 3. That's not good. In conjunction with these issues, Berger et al. Do not engage with the established literature in chemostratigraphy. Multiple studies have thoroughly developed and interpreted chemostratigraphic frameworks to establish disturbance or lack thereof at archaeological sites using the same category of analytical technique chosen by Berger et al. And in all of this is your list of citations here. In the same vein, the authors fail to address the fact that decomposing bodies have effects on the surrounding sediment, just as sediment composition affects the final composition of fossils. So it's going both ways here. Variation in sediment composition alone may only indicate the presence of a decomposing body. That's what I was saying earlier. In order to support intentional pit digging and burial, the sediment infill must be shown to be either from lower stratigraphic levels requiring full comparative sampling or brought in from another location. This sampling strategy implemented by Berger et al. Is insufficient to address their research question. So to summarize section B here, they didn't meet any of the prerequisites to carry out the analysis in section A. Right, so they didn't check all of their boxes, which even if Section A could stand on its own, and Folk and colleagues here argue that it can't, it would still be non-valid because these prerequisites haven't been met. It's not a good situation, folks. So I know I said I was going to incorporate Section C as we went along, but I didn't do that, so we're going to go over bits and pieces of Section C here. This is how Folk and colleagues propose the methods kind of should have been carried out, and sort of the bare minimum, the industry standard for some of these techniques. And they also go through and describe a lot of them in a basic way. So if you want to know like what X-ray fluorescence is and how it works as a spectrometric technique, you can do so. But they talk about a lot of major issues that Berger and colleagues had with like their methods using these techniques in particular, not even their analysis, not even missing the prerequisites, but like in how they carried out their X-ray, their XRF, excuse me. And they talk about problems with sampling and issues with reproducibility. This is key to reproducibility, is not reported in either Berger et al. 2023 or Dirks 2015. And one of the things that they're sort of hitting home here is that this issue, Folk et al. Would say, is chronic to this team and to this site. That's the impression that I get anyways. If that's not their intention, I'm sorry. That's what I'm gathering. They say here, in including the above overview, we hope to emphasize the need for studies utilizing XRF to report detailed methodological parameters, especially if quantitative data are generated. They talk about problems with the PSD, sampling in the field. And this all kind of leads up to the conclusion here where they say, we offer Section C of this paper both as a critique and as a simple targeted guide to precise decision-making and study design. These analytical methods are powerful tools in archaeological science, but must be applied within their own constraints and with full understanding of the data that they generate. So I know that a lot of this paper has been pretty jargony and pretty intense. There's just a lot to it, and there's a rich history behind what's been done at Rising Star and what people have thought about that. So we're going to end here with the conclusion, and then I'm going to give some of my sort of closing thoughts on the situation as it stands now. They say in their conclusion, in this paper, we endeavored to not only provide a scientific critique of a specific body of research, but also to illustrate the need for adherence to methodological and reporting best practices when utilizing geochemical and sedimentological techniques. The application of these methods to paleoanthropology is becoming progressively more important and offers the opportunity to investigate in more detail archaeological, paleoanthropological, and even genetic aspects of hominins. Though juxtaposition and detailed critiques with a theoretical background, or rather through that, we show that the preprints released by Berger et al. Do not meet established scientific standards. The problems identified are cumulative, resulting in unsupported conclusions. At the highest level, the research question, as stated, 3 prerequisites, each of which are not met. First, this work and previous work by this team does not demonstrate that the site contains sufficiently structured and non-homogeneous stratigraphy to enable the analysis attempted. Second, this area of the site does not preserve lateral stratigraphic continuity around the feature of interest, eliminating the ability to detect, let alone measure, disturbance of strata. And lastly, the sampling strategy was insufficient to demonstrate that the between strata variation is greater than the within stratum variation. This would be necessary to identify disturbance of one stratum into another, as proposed by the authors, for digging and infill of a burial pit. Many methodologies exist other than those chosen by Berger et al. For the analysis of these types of features present in rising star system. Though unsystemic petrographic thin sections are included, particularly conspicuous in its absence is a thorough micromorphological analysis noted by multiple peer reviewers, which has been applied to archaeological and natural sediments in cave context and has solidly demonstrated its ability to distinguish the sedimentary process driving the formation of deposits, the effects of human actions, including digging into natural sediments, and post-depositional weathering events that modified sediments and archaeological materials such as bone and artifacts buried with them. So you might recall from when we went over the reviews, micromorphology of the grains was something that a lot of people really did emphasize. They say at the level of data acquisition, we show that at minimum, the work presented does not provide sufficient methodological reporting. Through detailed assessment, we hypothesize the existence of methodological errors relating to sample preparation, the use of standard reference materials, and quantitative data transformations that call into question the accuracy of the reported XRF and PSD data. Even if these data are reliable, our analysis revealed missteps in data analysis, presentation, and interpretation. The authors incorrectly utilized PCA and identification of purported differences between samples, which were the foundation of their argument for a deliberately dug burial pit. Our reanalysis shows that the proposed differences are non-existent. They finish by saying, we wish to conclude with a general comment on scientific procedure in the field of paleoanthropology. To be clear, we do not dispute that it is possible that a small-brained hominin engaged in complex behavior and are quite open and excited by the prospect and its broader implications for human evolution. An ever-increasing body of work indicates the need to reorient old frameworks in light of new data. This is expected and welcomed and is a key component of how science functions. Presenting and testing bold ideas pushes our field forward and is a necessary part of the scientific process. The critique that we present here is not one of an idea, but purely of scientific procedure, an assessment of method data and what those data do and do not support. Here, the interpretations, the narrative, and the data are not aligned. As a field, we must reflect on how we structure research questions and consider the balance between exploratory research and hypothesis testing that are so central to what we do. In the author response to public peer reviews, the following is stated, quote, we suggest that it may be damaging to take natural accumulation as the standard null hypothesis for paleoanthropology and that it is more conservative in practice to engage remains with the null hypothesis of possible cultural information, unquote. The data presented by Berger et al. On our reanalysis do not support cultural formation, so calling for such a radical change in approach is both unwarranted and premature. We categorically reject this statement and wish to emphasize the central importance of natural accumulation as the null hypothesis in paleoanthropological research on possible interments. So this is the kind of situation that can be fraught for someone like me, a graduate student, to navigate, because I have opinions on it, but I'm sort of tentative in what I want to actually say on camera because this kind of thing can come back to bite you in the butt. What I will say is that it's gotta feel like getting a cold bucket of water dumped on your head if you're the Rising Star team to see this kind of piece come out. To see so many methodological and analytical errors come to light has got to be quite sobering. I would be probably proposing a restructuring of how things are done if I was on that team, assuming what folk and colleagues here say is correct, which I'm inclined to believe that it is, because it passed peer review and it wasn't published alongside it or despite it. I find it most of all alarming because this is like a critique of one aspect of one paper out of 3 papers with dozens of aspects to them, and this much was found to be in error. That is not good. However, I think there's something that needs to be pointed out here that is refreshing and uplifting and gives me a lot of confidence in the process. And that's that this was caught. That's that this was brought to light in the first place. That's that despite the fact that these papers were published regardless of the peer review, people are still coming out and double checking each other's work. That's the whole point of the scientific community. That's the whole point of peer review as a whole, is that we can check each other for mistakes. I wish that there weren't so many personal feelings, like, in all of this. I wish that it weren't so easy to get caught up in that kind of thing, and I by no means am proposing that I'm immune to this. It hurts to have your work critiqued, but at the end of the day, I think we all just want the science to be right and to be good and to move forward and to learn more. And peer review like this facilitates progress. It's what allows us to move forward. And for that reason, even though it's, a little bit intense, I'm glad that stuff like this happens. I'm glad that these kinds of exchanges exist. I wish it weren't so easy for people to get their feelings hurt. You know what I mean? If you watch a lot of my content, you know that I spend a lot of time debunking creationism and like young earth creationism in particular. And I want you to know that this right here is a perfect example when creationists ask you why you should trust the scientific community. And that's that the scientific community, generally speaking, doesn't let people get away with being wrong. Maybe the Rising Star team has a good explanation for this. If they do, then the exchange will continue and we'll learn more and we'll move forward, and it's just good no matter what. And as for Homo naledi, well, that little weirdo still remains interesting no matter what ends up happening or coming to light. So, my gentle and of course very modern apes, if you like what I do, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. That's a free way to support the channel. And if you want to support me in a more financial way, you can join my Patreon, or you can buy my merch from Redbubble. Everything helps, and patrons get their names at the end of every video. So that's kind of cool, if you ask me. In the meantime, I want to thank you guys from the bottom of my gentle and of course very modern heart for being such a curious primate, and I'll see you next time.